The people of Israel arrived in Egypt during Joseph's time, when the land was plagued by severe famine. Over time, however, a new Pharaoh rose to power, one who knew nothing of Joseph or the special relationship the Israelites had with Egypt. This new ruler saw them as a threat, fearing that their growing numbers could undermine Egypt's power. Thus began the oppression. The Israelites were reduced to slaves, forced to labor tirelessly in constructing cities and monuments. Their hands, cracked from the relentless work, molded clay bricks under the scorching heat. Their bodies were exhausted, but their spirits remained unbroken. However, Pharaoh's cruelty reached its peak when he decreed that every Hebrew baby boy should be cast into the Nile. In the midst of this darkness, the people cried out. Their prayers, their tears, and their cries for help were not in vain. The God of Israel, who had promised to protect them, was listening. So they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with heavy burdens, and they built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses, Exodus 1:11. In the midst of Pharaoh's ruthless decree, a Hebrew woman from the tribe of Levi gave birth to a son. From the moment she saw him, she knew he was special, a gift from God. For 3 months, she hid him in her home, fearing for his life. But the baby's cries and the constant threat of soldiers made it impossible to keep him hidden. With an indescribable pain, she made a brave decision. She constructed a small basket of reeds, sealed it with tar to make it float, and placed the child in the waters of the Nile. His older sister Miriam watched the basket from a distance. Then, something extraordinary happened. Pharaoh's daughter, while bathing in the river, saw the basket among the reeds. Upon opening it, she found the baby crying and, moved by his frailty, decided to adopt him as her own. Miriam, with great ingenuity, approached and suggested that the princess find a nurse for the child. Thus, unknowingly, Pharaoh's daughter allowed Moses' mother to care for him during his early years. Though Moses grew up in the royal palace, he never forgot his Hebrew roots. When she could hide him no longer, she took a papyrus basket, coated it with tar and pitch, and placed the child in it among the reeds by the riverbank. Exodus 2:3. Years passed, and Moses grew up surrounded by the luxury of the Egyptian palace. He was educated in the wisdom of the Egyptians, trained as a prince and warrior, yet he retained a deep connection to his people. One day, while walking among the Hebrew laborers, he saw an Egyptian overseer brutally beating a slave. Overcome with anger and a desire for justice, Moses killed the Egyptian and buried his body in the sand. His act, though driven by a desire to protect his people, soon came to light. When Pharaoh learned of it, he ordered Moses to be executed. Fearing for his life, Moses fled to the desert of Midian. There, far from the grandeur of the palace, he found refuge in the house of Jethro, a priest of that region. Moses married Zipporah, one of Jethro's daughters, and began a humble life as a shepherd. For years, Moses roamed the arid desert, tending to the flocks. Though it seemed his life had changed forever, the God of Israel was not done with him. In the silence of the desert, Moses was being prepared for a much greater purpose. When Pharaoh heard of this, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and dwelled in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. Exodus 2:15. One morning, while Moses was tending Jethro's sheep, he led them to Mount Horeb, known as the Mountain of God. In this remote place, something happened that would change his life forever. Moses saw a bush engulfed in flames, yet it wasn't consumed. Curious, he approached to investigate, and then he heard a voice calling his name. "Moses! Moses!" With a pounding heart, he replied, "Here I am." The voice, powerful yet compassionate, instructed him to remove his sandals, as the ground he stood on was holy. It was the God of his ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Terrified, Moses covered his face, realizing he was in the presence of the divine. God revealed that he had heard the cries of his people in Egypt and had chosen Moses to be Israel's deliverer. Shocked and full of doubt, Moses asked, "Who am I to go before Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" But God reassured him, saying, "I will be with you. This will be the sign that I have sent you. When you bring the people out of Egypt, you will worship on this mountain." Despite divine assurance, Moses remained doubtful. "What if they don't believe me?" he asked. God provided miraculous signs. His staff turned into a serpent, his hand became leprous, and was then healed. Even with these proofs, Moses argued, "Lord, I am slow of speech." Finally, God assigned his brother Aaron as his spokesman. God replied, "Go, for I will be with you, and this shall be the sign that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain." Exodus 3:12. With a heart full of doubts but assured of God's support, Moses returned to Egypt accompanied by Aaron. Upon arrival, they met with the elders of Israel and conveyed the words of hope and deliverance given by God. The miraculous signs performed by Moses convinced the leaders, and the people bowed in worship, grateful that God had heard their cries. Then Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the world at the time. With courage they declared, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, 'Let my people go, so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness.'" But Pharaoh, prideful and defiant, responded, "Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." Instead of relenting, Pharaoh hardened his heart further and increased the burden on the Israelites, demanding the same number of bricks without providing straw. This caused discontent among the people, who began to question Moses and Aaron. Afterward, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, 'Let my people go, so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness.'" Exodus 5:1. God began to display his extraordinary power to free his people. Through Moses and Aaron, he sent 10 devastating plagues upon Egypt, each directed not only at Pharaoh but also at the false gods worshipped by the Egyptians. These plagues demonstrated that the God of Israel was the one true God, sovereign over all creation. The first plague turned the waters of the Nile into blood, killing the fish and leaving Egypt without drinkable water. Yet Pharaoh hardened his heart. Then came frogs that swarmed the homes. The dust of the ground turned into swarms of gnats, and flies filled every corner. Despite the chaos, Pharaoh refused to release the Israelites. God continued to show his power. The plagues struck the livestock, caused painful boils on the Egyptians, and sent hail that destroyed the crops. Then a swarm of locusts devoured what little remained, and a thick darkness covered Egypt for 3 days, leaving the Egyptians in utter despair. Yet Pharaoh still refused to relent. Finally, the 10th and final plague arrived, the most devastating of all, the death of the firstborn. That night the angel of death passed through Egypt, taking the life of the firstborn in every Egyptian household, from Pharaoh's palace to the humblest servant. Only the homes of the Israelites, marked with the blood of the Lamb, were spared. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, "I have sinned this time, the Lord is righteous, and I and my people are wicked." Exodus 9:27. Before the 10th plague, God instituted a symbolic act that would mark the beginning of Israel's deliverance, the Passover. He gave Moses and Aaron precise instructions. Each Israelite family was to sacrifice a flawless lamb and mark their doorframes with its blood. That night, when the angel of death passed through Egypt, the blood-marked homes would be protected and their firstborn would be spared. God commanded that the lamb be roasted and eaten with bitter herbs and unleavened bread, ready for departure. This meal, known as Passover, became an eternal reminder of how the Lord saved his people. In the middle of the night, cries of grief echoed across Egypt, from Pharaoh's palace to the poorest homes, for there was not a household without someone dead. Finally, Pharaoh, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the tragedy, called Moses and Aaron, saying, "Get up, leave my people. Take your children, your flocks, and go serve the Lord as you have said." The Israelites, prepared according to God's instructions, departed in haste, taking their belongings, as well as the gold and silver given to them by the Egyptians. "When I see the blood, I will pass over you. No plague will touch you when I strike Egypt. Exodus 12:13. The people of Israel left Egypt under Moses' leadership, guided by a pillar of cloud during the day and a pillar of fire at night, visible symbols of God's presence. There was joy and hope in the hearts of the Israelites, but their peace was soon interrupted. Pharaoh, consumed by pride and a desire for revenge, gathered his army, including hundreds of chariots, to pursue the Israelites and bring them back as slaves. When the Israelites saw the Egyptian army approaching, they panicked. In front of them was the vast Red Sea, and behind them, Pharaoh's powerful forces. They cried out to Moses, "Did you bring us here to die in the wilderness? Were there no graves in Egypt?" Moses responded with faith and calm, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm and see the salvation the Lord will bring you today." Following God's instructions, Moses stretched out his staff over the sea, and a mighty east wind opened a dry path through the waters. The Israelites crossed safely, with walls of water standing on both sides. When the Egyptian army attempted to follow, God caused the waters to collapse, drowning the chariots and soldiers and destroying them completely. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind all that night, turning it into dry land, and the waters were divided. Exodus 14:21. After the glorious victory at the Red Sea, the Israelites continued their journey through the desert. However, the initial excitement soon gave way to the harsh realities of a nomadic life. Faced with scorching heat, a lack of water, and scarce food, the people began to complain. "Why did you bring us out of Egypt to die of hunger and thirst in this desert?" they asked Moses in desperation. Seeking guidance, Moses cried out to the Lord, and God provided miraculous solutions. First, he gave them water at Marah, turning the bitter waters sweet. Then, when hunger plagued the camp, God sent manna from heaven, a heavenly food that appeared each morning like dew. In the evening, he provided quail to satisfy their need for meat. When they were thirsty again, Moses, following God's command, struck a rock with his staff, and water flowed abundantly, enough for all the people and their livestock. Despite Israel's constant complaints, God never stopped showing his faithfulness. These miracles not only provided for Israel's physical needs, but also served as reminders of God's continuous presence and care, even in the most difficult times. So Moses cried out to the Lord, "What am I to do with these people? They are almost ready to stone me." Exodus 17:4. After weeks of travel, the Israelites arrived at the foot of Mount Sinai, a place that would become an eternal symbol of the covenant between God and his people. There, Moses ascended the mountain to meet with God, as it was shrouded in thick clouds, thunder and lightning, demonstrating the majesty and holiness of the Lord. The people watched from below with awe and fear. On the summit, God spoke to Moses and gave him the 10 Commandments, a set of laws that would form the foundation of the covenant between him and the Israelites. These laws not only established moral and ethical standards, but also defined how the people were to live in holiness and communion with God. As Moses received the stone tablets, God reaffirmed his promise to make Israel his chosen people, provided they remained faithful and obedient to his commands. This covenant set Israel apart as a nation destined to reflect God's glory among all nations. The Lord said to Moses, "Come up to me on the mountain and wait there, that I may give you the tablets of stone with the law and the commandments, which I have written for their instruction." Exodus 24:12. While Moses was on Mount Sinai, the people of Israel grew impatient. Unsure of how long Moses would be gone, they turned to Aaron and demanded, "Make us gods who will go before us, for we do not know what has happened to Moses." Under pressure from the crowd, Aaron collected their gold earrings and crafted a golden calf. He declared, "This is your God, O Israel, who brought you out of Egypt." The people celebrated with dancing and sacrifices, enthusiastically worshiping the idol. But on the mountain, God saw their rebellion and, in anger, told Moses to go down quickly because the people had corrupted themselves. God threatened to destroy them and begin a new nation through Moses. However, Moses fervently interceded, reminding God of his promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. His plea moved God to withhold his judgment. When Moses descended and saw the calf and the revelry, filled with indignation, he threw the stone tablets to the ground, breaking them. He then destroyed the golden calf, rebuked the people, and went back up the mountain to intercede once again. In his mercy, God renewed his covenant with Israel, demonstrating that his grace surpasses their failures. So Moses returned to the Lord and said, "Oh, what a great sin these people have committed. They have made themselves gods of gold." Exodus 32:31. After years of leadership, challenges, and miracles, Moses became a central figure in Israel's history and a model of faith and obedience. Under his guidance, the people of Israel experienced deliverance from bondage, divine provision in the wilderness, and the giving of the law at Sinai. However, Moses knew his mission had limits. Though he led the people to the brink of the promised land, he was not allowed to enter it due to a moment of disobedience when he struck the rock to bring forth water instead of speaking to it as God commanded. In his final days, Moses climbed Mount Nebo, where God allowed him to see the promised land. There, he reflected on the journey, recalling God's faithfulness at every step. Before his death, he blessed the tribes of Israel and entrusted the leadership to Joshua, who would continue the mission of bringing the people into the land God had promised. Moses' life not only shaped Israel, but also pointed to an even greater deliverer. His story foreshadowed Jesus, who, like Moses, would liberate his people, not from earthly bondage, but from the power of sin. Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. Deuteronomy 34:10.